Ethan Walker dropped the garden hose, sprinted across his own backyard, and vaulted the fence like a man half his age, because through the neighbor's window he'd just seen a woman collapse to her knees, soaking wet, screaming. He didn't know her name. He didn't know that 30 seconds earlier, he was the reason her house was flooding. And he sure didn't know that this stranger, the one now staring up at him through the water dripping off her chin, would end up saving his daughter's life and his own in a way no man his age ever expects. If you're watching this, do me a favor. Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. Hit subscribe, stay till the end, because what happens next changed everything. Ethan Walker had built his whole life around not being surprised anymore. Surprises in his experience were how a man got hurt. Surprises were the phone call at 2 a.m. Surprises were the lawyer's letter. The empty side of the closet, the way his ex-wife's wedding ring had sat on the kitchen counter one Tuesday morning, like a period at the end of a sentence he never got to finish. Ethan was 38 years old, and he had learned the hard way, the only way that ever really sticks, that the safest life was a predictable one. So he made everything predictable. Up at 5. Coffee black, no sugar, in the same chipped mug his daughter had painted for him 3 Father's Days ago. Eggs on the stove by 5:15. Lily's lunch packed by 5:30, turkey, no crusts. Apple slices, the little note he still wrote even though she was 8 now, and rolled her eyes at it. School drop-off by 7:40. Then work. Work meant fixing other people's homes. Ethan was a repair technician, which was a fancy way of saying that when something broke in somebody's house, he was the man they called. Leaking pipes, busted water heaters, sagging porch steps, rotten window frames. He was good at it, better than good, because Ethan Walker understood something most people didn't. He understood that everything in a house is holding up everything else. Pull one board wrong, and the whole thing shifts. Fix one thing wrong, and you create 3 new problems down the line. A house, he'd say, if you ever got him talking, which you rarely did, is just 100 small failures held together by somebody who cares enough to catch them before they spread. He was very good at catching other people's failures. His own, he mostly just lived with. "Dad." Lily's voice came from the back door that Saturday morning, and Ethan looked up from the coffee he wasn't really drinking. "What's up, Bug?" "Everybody has flowers except us." He set the mug down. "Everybody. The whole street." She crossed her arms the way her mother used to, and God, it still knocked the wind out of him a little every time. "The Hendersons have roses. The people on the corner have those purple ones. Even the empty house has flowers and nobody even lives there. That's just the weeds coming up nice this year." "They're still flowers." Ethan almost smiled. "You want flowers?" "I want," Lily said with the enormous seriousness only an 8-year-old can manage, "for our house to not look like the saddest house on the street." That landed somewhere he didn't expect it to, because she was right. He knew she was right. He'd walked past that backyard 1,000 times. The cracked dirt, the dead patch where the old owner's dog used to sleep, the flower beds his ex-wife had planted years ago, and then let die the same way she'd let everything else die. The saddest house on the street. His kid had put words to a thing he'd been feeling in his chest for 2 years and never once said out loud. "Okay," Ethan said. Lily blinked. Okay. We'll get flowers. Today. Get your shoes." The way her whole face changed, that was the thing. That was the only thing some days that got Ethan Walker out of bed. She lit up like somebody had flipped a switch behind her eyes, and she ran back inside yelling that she was getting her shoes. And Ethan stood there in his sad backyard by his sad house and thought, not for the first time, that he would burn the entire world down before he'd let anything take that light out of her. He didn't know how soon that promise would get tested. They spent the morning at the garden center. Lily picked out marigolds because they were orange, like a sunset that got squished flat, and something called impatiens, because she liked that the man behind the counter said, "You plant them in the shade, so they're the flowers that don't need the sun to be happy," which Ethan wrote down somewhere in the back of his mind to think about later. They bought a bag of soil that was too heavy and a little hand shovel with a green handle and a new nozzle for the hose because the old one leaked. That nozzle. Ethan would think about that nozzle a lot later. By early afternoon, he was on his knees in the dirt and Lily was helping, which meant she was mostly narrating, and the sun was out, and for 1 hour, one single unremarkable hour, Ethan Walker was almost nearly something like content. "Water first or dig first?" Lily asked. "Dig first, then plant, then water." "Why?" "Because that's the order." "But why?" "Because you loosen the ground so the roots have somewhere to go," Ethan said. "Then you put the flower in, then you water it so it settles. You water before you dig, you just make mud. You water before you plant, the hole fills up. There's an order to everything, Bug. You do it out of order, you make a mess." He would remember saying that too. There's an order to everything. You do it out of order, you make a mess. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of humor about men who talked like that. They finished planting around 2. Lily's knees were black with dirt, and she was grinning, and the little marigolds sat in their fresh holes, looking hopeful, and Ethan stood up, and his back cracked in 3 places, and he picked up the hose to water them in. "Can I do it?" Lily asked. "You can hold it with me." She grabbed the hose in front of his hands, and he turned the spigot, and the water came on, and for a second it was fine. It was a father and his daughter watering flowers on a Saturday. That's all it was. Then Ethan took a step back to grab the shovel, and he stepped on the hose. Later, he'd try to reconstruct exactly what happened, and he never quite could. His heel came down on the hose maybe 8 feet back from the nozzle. The water, which had nowhere to go, backed up and pressurized and hit that brand new nozzle Lily was holding. And the nozzle set wrong, or maybe just cheap. He never figured out which twisted hard in her small hands and jumped like a live thing. "Dad." He heard her before he understood. He turned. The hose was whipping the nozzle, spitting a stream of water hard as a fire truck's, and it arced up over the fence, up and over a perfect silver rope of water, and went straight through the open kitchen window of the house next door. For 1 full second, Ethan Walker just watched it happen. The way you watch a glass fall off a counter. Too late to catch it, too slow to stop it, just watching physics do its work. "Oh no," Lily whispered. Ethan lunged and stomped the spigot off with his boot, and the hose died in his daughter's hands, and the backyard went quiet, and from the house next door came a sound he would hear in his memory for the rest of his life. A woman screaming. Now Ethan had been divorced 2 years. In that time, he had not run toward a single thing. He had walked away from a marriage. He had walked away from friendships that reminded him of his old life. He had walked calmly and carefully through every day, because calm and careful was how you survived. He had not run toward anything since the day his daughter was born. He ran. He didn't think. That's the part he'd tell you about if he ever told anybody, which he wouldn't. He didn't decide to run. His body just did it. He dropped the hose and crossed his backyard in 4 strides and put one hand on the top of the fence and went over it, a 38-year-old man with a bad back going over a 5-foot fence like he was 19, because through that kitchen window he'd seen a shape go down. A person. Falling. He hit the neighbor's grass and stumbled and caught himself and came up running and got to her back door, and it was open, and he went through it saying, Ma'am, are you okay? I'm so sorry, are you?" And he stopped, because the woman was on her knees in her flooded living room, soaking wet from the chest. Up her hair plastered to her face, and she was surrounded by paper. Documents. Dozens of them, hundreds spread across the floor in a spreading puddle, the ink already bleeding the pages, already curling. And she was screaming, "No." Not screaming. She was crying and trying to save them, scooping wet paper up in both arms, while the water kept spreading, and the scream Ethan had heard from over the fence hadn't been fear at all. It had been grief. "Please," the woman was saying to no one, to the papers, to herself. "Please, no, no, no." Ethan didn't know what he was looking at. He didn't know that those weren't just papers. He didn't know that they were in fact the only copies of 2 years of case files, children's files, kids she'd counseled, kids whose whole broken histories lived on those pages, kids she'd been fighting a losing battle to keep from falling through the cracks. He didn't know that she'd brought them home because the youth center where she worked was shutting down, and there was no one left to be their memory but her. He didn't know that this stranger on her knees had spent 2 years being the one person who remembered these kids, and that a rope of water from his garden hose had just erased them. He didn't know any of that. That would come later. What he knew in that moment was that a woman was on the floor of a flooded room, crying like her heart had come apart, and it was his fault. Ethan got down on his knees in the water beside her. "Where's Dry?" he said. She looked up, really looked at him for the first time. Her eyes were red and stunned, and she clearly had no idea who he was. "What?" "Dry ground. Where's the highest dry spot in the house? Point." The stairs, but give me the ones you've got. Come on, both arms. Give them here." And something in the way he said it flat, certain the voice of a man who had spent his whole life walking into other people's disasters and knowing exactly what to do, got through to her. She dumped the wet armful of papers into his arms, and Ethan stood and carried them to the stairs and laid them out flat on the dry wooden steps one at a time, fast spreading them. And then he came back for more. "You get that side," he said. "Don't stack them wet. They'll stick and tear. Lay them flat. Go." She went. For the next 4 minutes, Ethan actually counted later, playing it back. The two of them worked in total silence on their knees in the water, saving what could be saved. He killed the spread of the flood by grabbing every towel off the rack in her downstairs bathroom and throwing them down in a line. He found the wet, dry vac in a hall closet like he'd lived there his whole life, because a man who fixes houses can find a wet, dry vac in a stranger's house in the dark, and he ran it while she laid pages out across every dry surface in the room. And slowly, the disaster stopped being a disaster and started being just a very bad afternoon. When it was over, the two of them sat down on the wet floor with their backs against the wall, breathing hard, soaked to the skin, surrounded by paper drying on every surface, like the world's saddest party decorations. The woman spoke first. "Who are you?" Ethan wiped water off his face with a wet hand, which did nothing. "Ethan Walker. I live—" He pointed at the wall at the fence at the general direction of his crimes. "Next door." She looked at him. Then she looked at the drying documents. Then she looked at the window where the sunlight was coming through the very window his hose had come through, and something moved across her face. Ethan watched it happen, watched her put it together, and he braced himself for the yelling. He deserved the yelling. He'd have yelled. "The water?" she said slowly. "That came from your house." "Yes, ma'am." "You flooded my living room." "Yes, ma'am. I stepped on my daughter was holding the it doesn't matter. Yes, that was me. I am so sorry. I'll pay for everything. The floor, He gestured helplessly at the papers. "Whatever these are, I'll fix all of it. I fix things, that's what I do. I'll make it right. I promise you I'll make it right." She kept staring at him. And Ethan, who had learned 2 years ago to stop expecting anything good, waited for the storm. Instead, the woman started to laugh. It started small, a hitch in her breath that he thought at first was more crying, and then it built, and then she had both hands over her face, and she was laughing. This exhausted, wrung-out, helpless laugh, laughing so hard the tears came back, and Ethan sat there completely lost. Because in 38 years of life, he had never once seen a person respond to catastrophe like this. "I'm sorry," he said. "Are you? Should I get someone?" "No." She wiped her eyes. She was still laughing. "No, oh my God. I'm fine. I'm not fine. Do you know what today is?" "Saturday." "Today," she said, "is the single worst day I have had in about a year. And I have had some days. And I was sitting here this morning genuinely thinking out loud to my empty house that nothing else could possibly go wrong. And then a wall of water came through my window." She looked at him. "You have to admit, as an answer from the universe, that's got style." Ethan didn't know what to say, so he said the true thing. "I really am sorry." "I know." Her laughing faded into something quieter. She held out a wet hand. "Claire. Bennett." He shook it. Her hand was cold from the water. Ethan. You said, twice. Half a smile. You're the guy from the sad house. He blinked. The what? Oh. Claire winced. Nothing. I've noticed your house. I moved back a few months ago, and I walk in the mornings, and I noticed, never mind that was rude, I'm soaking wet and I've lost my filter. No, say it. It just always looked a little sad is all. Blinds always down, no flowers. She glanced toward the window. Although, were you planting flowers? Just now? Is that what this was? Ethan felt something strange happen in his chest. My daughter said the same thing. About the house. This morning. Almost the exact same word. Yeah, the saddest house on the street. That's what she said. That's why we bought the flowers. That's why... He gestured at the whole ruined room. That's how you ended up like this. Because my 8-year-old thinks our house is sad. Claire looked at him for a long moment. The laughter was gone now. Something gentler had come into her face, and it made Ethan uncomfortable, because it had been a long time since anyone had looked at him like that, like they were actually seeing him and not minding what they saw. Well, she said quietly, for what it's worth. A man who buys his daughter flowers because she said the house was sad. That's not a sad house, Mr. Walker. Ethan looked away. His throat did something he didn't like. That was the moment. If you asked him later and no one ever did. But if they had, that was the exact moment. Not the flood. Not the fence. Not the laughter. This. A wet stranger on the floor of her ruined living room, telling him his house wasn't sad, and getting it so completely wrong and so completely right at the same time that he had to look away to keep it together. He didn't know her yet. He didn't know she'd lost her job. He didn't know she was 2 weeks from putting this house, her grandmother's house, up for sale. He didn't know that the papers he'd just helped her save were the last thread holding her to a purpose she'd built her whole life around. He didn't know she cried outside on her own steps at night when she thought nobody could see. He didn't know that she was in almost every way that mattered exactly as broken as he was. He just knew that he didn't want to leave this room yet. Dad, Lily's voice small and scared from the back door. Ethan turned. His daughter stood there with dirt on her knees and terror on her face, and he understood at once that she'd been afraid to follow him over, afraid of what she'd done, afraid he'd be angry, afraid of the screaming she'd heard. It's okay, Bug, he said, standing. Come here. Everything's okay. Lily crept in, staring at the water, at the papers, at the wet stranger on the floor. Did I break your house? Ethan opened his mouth to answer. Claire got there first. You know what? Claire said, pushing herself up off the floor, wincing, walking over to crouch down in front of Lily so they were eye to eye. You didn't break anything. You want to know what actually happened here? Lily nodded wide-eyed. For a year. Claire said, I have been living next door to your dad, and neither one of us has ever said a single word to the other. Not one. Not hello, not good morning, nothing. And I bet if nothing had happened, we'd have gone on like that for another year. 2 neighbors 10 feet apart, total strangers. She smiled. And then you and your dad planted some flowers, and the whole ocean came through my window, and now look. Now I know your dad's name. I know his kid buys I'm sorry your dad buys you flowers. I know he'll drop everything and jump a fence for a stranger who's screaming. She tilted her head. So, no, you didn't break my house. You introduced me to my neighbors. That's a pretty good day's work for... She looked up at Ethan. How old? 8, Lily said. 8. That's a heck of a day's work for 8. And Ethan watched his daughter, his careful, worried, too grown-up, too fast daughter, who had been carrying more than any 8-year-old should carry since the day her mother left. He watched her look at this soaking wet stranger and slowly, cautiously smile. He hadn't seen her smile at a grown-up who wasn't him in a long time. Something shifted in Ethan Walker's chest, in the place where he kept everything locked down, and he didn't have a name for it, and he didn't trust it. And every instinct he'd built over 2 hard years, told him to say a polite goodbye, to keep his promise about the money, to fix her floor, and go home, and pull the blinds down, and get back to being predictable. He almost did. "I mean it about the money," he said instead. "And the floor. I'll come by tomorrow with a fan set up. Get everything dried out proper before it warps. And these—" He nodded at the papers. "If any of them are still legible, I know a place that can dry and press documents. I can take them Monday, if you want." Claire straightened up, studied him. "Why?" she asked. "Because I flooded them." "No." She shook her head slowly. "That's not why. You already apologized. You already offered to pay. That covers your debt. Fixing my floor, driving my papers across town, coming back tomorrow, that's more than covering a debt." She wasn't smiling now. She was just looking at him steady and clear, the way he imagined she looked at those kids in her files. "So why?" And Ethan Walker, who did not talk about himself, who had turned not talking about himself into an art form, who had gone 2 full years without telling a single living soul the truth about how he was really doing, opened his mouth to give her some easy answer. "Because you didn't yell," he heard himself say. Claire went still. "You should have yelled?" Ethan went on, and he couldn't stop. Now it was coming out of him, like the water had come out of that hose, too much pressure behind it, and nowhere to go. "I flooded your house. I ruined your whatever these are. I would have yelled. Everyone I know would have yelled. The last person who lived in my house, she yelled about a lot less than this." He stopped, started again. "And you didn't. You laughed. And then you told my kid she didn't break anything, and you got her to smile, and I—" He shook his head. "I don't know. I haven't seen anybody handle a bad day like that in a long time. Maybe ever. And I guess I wanted to be around it a little longer. That's the truth. That's why. I'm sorry. That's a weird thing to say to a stranger. I'll get the fans, Ethan." He stopped. Claire Bennett was looking at him with something in her eyes that he would spend the next several weeks trying and failing not to think about. Not pity. He knew pity. He'd been swimming in other people's pity for 2 years, and he was sick to death of it. This wasn't that. This was recognition. "You want to know why I laughed?" she said quietly. Instead of yelling, "Yeah, because I have been having the worst year of my life. And I have been handling it completely alone. And I was sitting in this house this morning honestly wondering if a single other person on this earth would even notice if I just packed up and disappeared." She glanced at the window again, at the impossible silver rope of water that had come through it. "And then you flooded my living room, and you jumped a fence, and a total stranger got down on his knees in my flood and started saving my papers before he even knew my name." Her voice caught just slightly. "You want to know why I laughed, Ethan? I laughed because for the first time in about a year somebody showed up. That's all I wanted. Somebody to just show up." She wiped her eye with the back of her wet hand and let out a shaky breath. "And the universe sent me a plumber with a fire hose. So, you'll forgive me if I found that a little bit funny." The room was quiet. Lily looked back and forth between the two adults, not quite understanding perfectly. And Ethan Walker stood there in a stranger's flooded living room, soaked to the bone. His whole careful, predictable life having just been kicked sideways by 8 feet of garden hose and a nozzle set wrong. And he felt something he had promised himself 2 years ago he would never let himself feel again. Hope. The dangerous kind. The kind that could be taken away. "Tomorrow," he said, because it was all he could manage. "I'll come by tomorrow. With the fans." "Okay," Claire said. "And I'll bring the—" He gestured at the papers. "Okay. And Lily made too many cookies yesterday. She'll want to bring you some. Fair warning, she'll knock." Claire smiled. Really smiled, the exhaustion falling off her face for just a second, and looked down at Lily. "You tell your dad," she said to the little girl, "that my door is always open." She looked back up at Ethan, and there was that flash of something, that mischief he'd first seen when she was laughing on the floor. "Although after today maybe I'll start closing the window." Ethan surprised himself. He laughed. It came out rusty and unpracticed, like a machine that hadn't been run in a long time, and Lily's head snapped up at the sound of it, because she couldn't remember the last time she'd heard her father laugh like that. And Claire heard it too, and for just a moment, the three of them stood in that wrecked, dripping room, and none of them were strangers anymore. Ethan gathered his daughter under his arm and steered her toward the back door. "Tomorrow," he said again. "Tomorrow." Claire agreed. He climbed back over the fence the normal way this time and lifted Lily over, and they walked back across their own sad backyard to their own sad house, past the marigolds that had started all of it. And Ethan Walker did not pull the blinds down that night. He sat at his kitchen table long after Lily went to bed, and he thought about a woman who laughed when the ocean came through her window, and he thought about how she'd said somebody showed up, and he thought about the recognition in her eyes, because he knew exactly what that recognition was. He'd seen it in the mirror every morning for 2 years. It was the look of a person who had been handling everything alone for so long that they'd forgotten there was any other way to do it. He didn't know her story yet. He didn't know she was about to lose the house. He didn't know that in a few weeks he'd find her crying on those front steps in the dark, or that everything he'd just started to feel was going to run headfirst into everything he was afraid of. He just knew that for the first time in 2 years, when he thought about tomorrow, he wasn't dreading it. And Ethan Walker, 38 years old, who had built his entire life around never being surprised again, sat alone in his kitchen and let himself be surprised. The cookies came the next morning, before Ethan had even finished his coffee. He heard the knock, small, insistent 4 quick raps low on the door, where a kid's knuckles land, and by the time he got there, Lily was already halfway down the front walk, in her socks, a plate of cookies wrapped in foil, balanced in both hands like she was carrying the crown jewels. Bug. Shoes. "There's no time for shoes, Dad." There is always time for shoes. But she was already crossing into Claire's yard, and Claire's door was already opening, and Ethan stood in his own doorway and watched a thing he hadn't planned for and couldn't have stopped. Claire came out in a robe with her hair still wet from the shower, and she saw Lily coming with that plate, and her whole face did something. It cracked open. Like she hadn't expected anyone to knock on her door for a good reason in a long, long time. "Are those for me?" Claire asked. "I made too many," Lily announced, which was the story her father had planted, and she was sticking to it. "So you have to take them or they'll go bad." "Well, we can't let cookies go bad. That's practically a crime." Claire took the plate and peeked under the foil. "Chocolate chip, my favorite." "Everybody says chocolate chip is their favorite," Lily said suspiciously. "That's what people say when they don't have a real favorite." Claire laughed, and Ethan, watching from 40 feet away, felt that laugh land somewhere in his chest again. "You're right," Claire admitted, crouching down. "Okay, the truth. My actual favorite is oatmeal raisin, but I don't tell people that because they look at me like I insulted their mother. You're the first person I've told in years." Lily considered this with tremendous gravity. "That's a weird favorite." "I know. But I won't tell anybody." "Deal." And just like that, Ethan understood, standing in his doorway with cold coffee, that his daughter had made a friend. Not a nice lady who lives next door. A friend. Somebody Lily was going to trust. He didn't know yet whether that terrified him or not. Both, probably. It was usually both. He came out with the fans, 3 of them, and a coil of extension cord over his shoulder, and Claire's smile shifted into something warmer and more careful when she saw him. "You actually came. I said I would." "People say a lot of things." There it was again. That flat, tired certainty about the way people were. Ethan recognized it because he owned the same one. "Not me," he said. "I say what I'll do, and I do what I say. It's kind of the only thing I've got left going for me." Claire looked at him a second longer than she needed to. "I'll take it." He spent the morning in her living room drying it out. He set the fans in a triangle to move the air the right way, pulled up the corner of the rug to check the subfloor, ran his hand along the baseboards, feeling for the soft spots where water hides and waits and ruins a house from the inside out. 6 months later. Claire hovered at first, then gave up hovering, and made him a real cup of coffee, and then sat on the stairs with the driest of her papers in her lap, sorting the survivors from the dead. "Can I ask what those are?" Ethan said, not looking up from the baseboard. "You don't have to tell me, I flooded a room and it turned out I was flooding those specifically, and you looked at those the way people look at photo albums in a fire." Claire was quiet long enough that he thought he'd overstepped. "They're kids," she finally said. He stopped. "Case files. I'm a counselor, was a counselor, at the youth center over on Fulton." She smoothed a warped page flat with her palm. "These are the ones nobody else was keeping track of, the ones who fall through. You'd be amazed how easy it is for a kid to just fall through. Nobody's job to remember them. Parents gone, or worse than gone. They bounce between schools, systems, addresses, and there's supposed to be a file that follows them so the next person who gets them doesn't start from zero. But the files get lost, or nobody updates them, or the center that was holding them." She stopped. "Closes," Ethan said. Claire looked up at him. "You said, was a counselor," he said. "Past tense. And you brought 2 years of files home to your kitchen. People don't do that unless there's nobody left at the office to leave them with." Claire set the page down. "They cut the funding," she said. 3 weeks ago. State line item gone in a budget nobody read. 40 years the center's been open. 40 years. And it closes in June because it was a number on a spreadsheet." Her voice didn't rise. That was the thing Ethan noticed. She said it the way you say a thing you've already cried about and don't have any crying left for. "So I brought them home. Because if I don't remember these kids, nobody does. And now half of them are—" She gestured at the ruined pages and her jaw tightened. "Soup." The room was quiet except for the fans. "I'm sorry," Ethan said. And he meant it in a way he hadn't meant it yesterday. Yesterday he'd been sorry about a floor. Today he understood he'd flooded something that couldn't be replaced. "It's not your fault," Claire said. "Some of it's exactly my fault. The water, sure, not the rest." She laughed, but there was no humor left in it. "The rest of it's a governor I've never met, and a budget line, and the fact that helping kids doesn't make anybody money. That's a very old story, Ethan. You just happened to add a plot twist with a hose." He almost let it go there. He almost just finished the baseboards and packed up his fans and went home because that was the safe thing, the predictable thing, the Ethan Walker thing to do. Stay in your lane, fix the floor, don't get tangled in a stranger's ruin. Instead, he said, "How many are legible?" "Still, the ones that survived." "I don't know, maybe half." "Get me the wet ones." Claire frowned. "The wet ones are gone, Ethan." "Maybe, maybe not. There's a shop off Industrial does document recovery freeze drying. They pull the water out without the ink running further. Insurance companies use them after floods. It's not cheap, but I said I'd pay for what I ruined, and I meant it." He was already pulling out his phone. "How many pages roughly?" Claire stared at him. "You can't be serious." "I'm the least funny person you'll ever meet, ask anybody." "Ethan?" She stood up off the stairs, papers sliding off her lap. "You flooded my house by accident 24 hours ago. You do not owe me a freeze-drying bill. Nobody does this. Do you understand that nobody does this?" "You keep saying that." He looked up from the phone. "Nobody does this. You said it yesterday too, about showing up." He held her eyes. "Somebody should, that's all. Somebody should do this. Might as well be the guy who broke it." And Claire Bennett, who had spent 3 weeks being told by everyone around her that these files were a lost cause, that the center was gone, that she should let it go and move on and take care of herself. For once, Claire stood in her drying living room and put a hand over her mouth and turned away so this stranger wouldn't see her cry twice in 2 days. Ethan pretended to be very interested in the baseboard. That was the second day. The pie came on the fourth. Ethan found it on his own porch when he got home from a job, a whole pie under a dish towel still warm, a note tucked underneath in handwriting that leaned hard to the right like it was in a hurry. "Please stop being nice to me," it said. "It's very inconvenient. I have a whole system built around people disappointing me, and you're wrecking it. C. P.S. This is Peach. Nobody's favorite. Universally acceptable. Ethan read it twice standing on his porch, then he read it a third time. Then he did something he hadn't done in 2 years without a reason, which was smile at a piece of paper. "What's that?" Lily asked, coming out. "Pie." "From Claire. From Claire. Can we have it for dinner?" "Pie is not dinner." "It could be a dinner." "Get inside, bug." But he cut them each a slice after the real dinner, and Lily declared it the best pie in the history of pies. And Ethan didn't disagree, and that night he wrote back on the same note and walked it over and slid it under Claire's door, because he didn't have the nerve to knock. "My daughter says it's the best pie in the history of pies. She's 8 and prone to exaggeration, but in this case, she's right. E.P.S. Everybody says Peach is their favorite when they don't have a real favorite." He heard her laugh through the door. He was already walking back across the yard by then, fast like a teenager, but he heard it. It carried. Over the next 2 weeks, the notes became a thing. That was the word Ethan used for it in his own head, when he let himself think about it, which he tried not to do. A thing. She'd leave one. He'd answer it. He'd leave one. She'd answer that. Little scraps of paper going back and forth under 2 doors, 10 feet apart, because 2 grown adults who talked easily to each other's faces apparently found it easier to be honest in ink. She told him on paper that she'd inherited the house from her grandmother. He told her on paper that his wife had left 2 years ago, and it still felt like last Tuesday. She wrote back, "Last Tuesday's a long time. Some of us are still standing in it." He read that one about 40 times, and Lily was over there more and more. Claire helped her with a science project on the water cycle. Ethan appreciated the irony and said so, and Claire wrote back, "You're not as funny as you think, but you're funnier than you look," which he taped to the inside of a kitchen cabinet where nobody would see it. Claire listened when Lily talked about her mother, which Lily never did with Ethan, because Lily had figured out at 7 years old that talking about her mother made her father go somewhere behind his eyes, and she'd decided all on her own to protect him from it. Ethan only found out because Claire told him gently one evening on the porch steps. "She misses her mom," Claire said. "You know that. I know that. She won't say it to you. She thinks it hurts you, so she says it to me instead." Claire looked at him carefully. "I'm telling you because you should know, not because you did anything wrong. She's a good kid, Ethan. She's a really good kid, and she's carrying something an 8-year-old shouldn't have to carry, and she's carrying it quietly so it doesn't fall on you." Ethan sat with that. It hurt in a specific way. "What do I do?" "You already do it. You show up every day. You pack the lunches, you write the notes." She smiled. "You buy the flowers. You just maybe let her carry a little less. Let her know she's allowed to miss her mom out loud, that it won't break you." "What if it does break me?" He didn't mean to say it. It came out anyway. That was the thing about Claire. He was starting to understand. True things came out around her, whether he meant them to or not. Like she had some kind of gravity that pulled the truth loose. "Then it breaks you," Claire said quietly, "and you're broken in front of your daughter for one afternoon, and she learns that the people who love her are allowed to hurt. And that's not the worst lesson a kid can learn, Ethan. The worst lesson is that the people who love you never let you see them hurt. Because then you grow up thinking you have to do all your hurting alone." She paused. "Ask me how I know." He looked at her. "Don't," she said, standing up, brushing off her jeans. "That's enough truth for one porch. I'm going to bed." She went inside. He sat on the steps a while longer. And he thought something's wrong. Underneath all of it, something's wrong with her, and she's doing the exact thing she just told me my daughter does. Carrying it quiet. Protecting everybody else from it. He was right. He just didn't know how right until the following Thursday. It was late past 11, and Ethan couldn't sleep, which happened more nights than not, and he went to the kitchen for water and glanced out the window over the sink the way you do not looking for anything. And there was Claire, on her front steps, in the dark, alone, crying. Not the way she'd cried over the papers that had been shock and ambush. This was different. This was the crying of someone who'd waited until they were sure no one could see. Shoulders down, face in her hands. The kind of crying a person does when they've been holding it all day and the day is finally over, and there's nobody left to be strong for. Ethan knew that crying. He'd done that crying. He'd done it on his own back steps more nights than he'd ever admit. He should have looked away. Given her the privacy she'd clearly gone out into the dark to find. That was the decent thing. He put on his shoes and went outside. He didn't say anything. He just crossed the yard and sat down on the step below her, not too close, and looked out at the street and let her decide what to do about it. For a long minute she didn't do anything. She just kept crying quieter now, aware of him. "You saw me from the window," she said finally, thick. "Yeah." "You could have let me be?" "Yeah." "Why didn't you?" Ethan thought about it. "Because a couple weeks ago a stranger came over a fence for me before he knew my name," he said. "And it turned out that was the thing I'd been needing. Somebody to just show up. You told me that. So." He shrugged. "I'm showing up. You can tell me to leave and I'll leave, but I figured I'd at least make the offer." Claire laughed, wet and broken. "You're using my own words against me. I'm using your good words for you. There's a difference." She wiped her face, took a breath that shook on the way in, and then, because it was dark, and because he'd shown up, and because she was so tired of carrying it alone, Claire Bennett told him the rest. "I'm losing the house," she said. Ethan went still. "The center closing, that's not just the kids, Ethan. That was my job. That was my whole income. I've got a mortgage on a house I inherited free and clear, which sounds impossible, until you find out my grandmother took out a reverse mortgage before she died to pay for the care that kept her alive the last 2 years. And I've been covering it on a counselor's salary, which is a joke, and now I don't even have the joke." Her voice cracked. "I've got about 6 weeks. Then the bank takes it, or I sell it first, and at least walk away with something instead of nothing. And there's an offer, a real one. Not for the house for me. A center 2 states over wants to hire me, better pay. Actual funding. A fresh start where nobody knows me as the woman whose center closed. When?" Ethan managed. "They need an answer by the end of the month." She looked at him in the dark. "So I'd sell the house, take the job, leave, and honestly, Ethan, until about 2 weeks ago that plan made perfect sense. Sell the sad memories, start over somewhere new, stop drowning." She wiped her eyes. "And then somebody flooded my living room, and their kids started knocking on my door with cookies. And now the plan that made perfect sense 2 weeks ago feels like—" She stopped, shook her head. "It doesn't matter. I have to be smart. I can't turn down a real job and keep a house I can't pay for because a nice man came over a fence one time. That's not a plan. That's a fairy tale. And I'm 36, and I'm out of money, and I don't get fairy tales." Ethan sat there in the dark and felt something enormous and dangerous open up under him. Because here was the thing. Here was the exact shape of the thing he'd spent 2 years terrified of. He'd let himself feel something. He'd let his daughter feel something. He'd unlocked the room he kept locked. And now, right on the schedule, he'd known in his bones was coming. The good thing was getting ready to be taken away. 6 weeks, then gone. Every instinct in him said the same thing it had said for 2 years. Pull back now. Pull back tonight. She's leaving, so start the goodbye now. Protect Lily, protect yourself, get out before it costs you. You knew this would happen. Things don't stay. You knew. Say something, Claire said. Ethan opened his mouth, and what came out was not what 2 years of Ethan Walker wanted him to say. How much, he said, to keep it, the house, the mortgage, how much are you behind, and how much a month to stay ahead of it? Claire blinked. Ethan, I fix houses for a living, Claire. I know contractors. I know property. I know how money moves through a house. Maybe there's, I don't know, a refinance, a tenant for the upstairs, a grant. You're a counselor. There's got to be grants. I don't know yet. But you're talking like there's only 2 doors: sell or lose it. And in my experience, there's always a third thing nobody's looked for yet. He was talking fast now, faster than he meant to, because the alternative to talking was feeling, and he wasn't ready to feel it. Give me a week. Let me look. Before you call that center and tell them yes. Just 1 week, that's all I'm asking. Claire stared at him. In the dark, he couldn't read her face. Why? She said. And it was the same why she'd asked him on the flooded floor, the one that saw right through him. And this time, Ethan didn't have a safe answer. This time, the safe answers had all run out. Because I don't want you to go, he said. The words sat in the dark between them, and I'm not saying that to be, I know how it sounds. I know it's not fair to say to a woman making a smart decision about her life. I'm not asking you to stay for me. I don't have any right to ask that we've known each other 2 weeks. He pushed a hand through his hair. But you asked me why, and I'm done lying to you because you've never once lied to me, not even on the paper, not even when the truth made you look bad. So there it is. I don't want you to go. My kid doesn't want you to go. And I'd rather help you find a way to stay and have it not work out than watch you leave without even trying. That's the why. Claire was crying again, but it was different crying now. You barely know me, she whispered. I know you laughed when the ocean came through your window, Ethan said. I know you brought me a pie with a note telling me to stop being nice to you. I know you kept 2 years of case files for kids that the whole world already forgot, and you cried harder over losing those than over losing your house. I know you tell my daughter she's allowed to miss her mom out loud. His voice was rough now. I know enough, Claire. I know enough. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Claire said very quietly, 1 week. Ethan let out a breath he'd been holding since she said losing the house. 1 week, Claire said again, and I don't want you to spend a dime of your own money on my mortgage. Ethan Walker, I mean it. I will find out, and I will never forgive you. Your help, your hands, your contacts. Yes. Your money, no. That's the deal, or there's no deal. That's the deal, he lied. He was already that very second running numbers in his head. He had savings. Not a lot. Some. Set aside slow over 2 years the emergency fund, the never-touch-it money. And he was already deciding, sitting there in the dark, that this counted as an emergency. He didn't tell her that. He'd learned something from her about knowing when to keep the truth in your pocket. Okay, Claire said. She wiped her face one more time and let out a long, unsteady breath, and something in her shoulders came down from where they'd been living for 3 weeks. Okay, I can't believe I'm doing this. I had a plan. I had a good, smart, sensible plan, and you and your 8-year-old and your garden hose have completely wrecked it. For what it's worth, Ethan said, you wrecked mine too. You had a plan. Pull the blinds down and never feel anything again for the rest of my life. Claire laughed, a real one, surprised out of her. That's a terrible plan. It was working great until 2 weeks ago. They sat on the steps a while longer, not talking, the worst of it out in the open now between them, and it was easier out in the open the way it always is. When Claire finally stood up to go inside, she stopped at her door and looked back at him. Ethan. Yeah. Thank you for showing up. He nodded, throat tight, and watched her go in. Then he crossed the dark yard back to his own house, and he did not feel like a man who'd been surprised. He felt like a man who'd made a decision. The next morning, he was at the county assessor's office when it opened. By noon, he had the full picture of Claire's reverse mortgage, and it was bad, but it was not the specific kind of bad she thought it was, and Ethan Walker knew the difference, the way a doctor knows the difference between the diagnosis that kills you and the one that just scares you. He called a mortgage guy he'd done work for. He called a lawyer who owed him a favor for a busted water main she never got billed for. He drove out to Industrial and picked up the freeze-dried documents, and the man behind the counter said they'd saved 70%. And Ethan carried 2 boxes of recovered children back to his truck and sat in the parking lot and looked at them for a while before he drove home. He didn't tell Claire any of it yet. He wanted a plan, not a hope, before he brought it to her. That was the Ethan Walker in him, the fixer, the man who didn't say a thing until he could do the thing. But 3 days into his 1 week on a Tuesday afternoon, everything got faster. He was under a client's sink across town when his phone rang, and it was the school, and the second he heard the words, the school. His whole body went cold. Because you never get a call from the school in the middle of the day. That's good news. Mr. Walker. This is Nurse Patterson at Lincoln Elementary. Lily's okay. I want to lead with that. She's okay, but she took a fall on the playground and we think her wrist might be broken. We need a parent to come. Ethan was out from under the sink and in his truck before she finished the sentence. He was 15 minutes out. Rush of a job across town, school on the other side. He drove it in 9, and the whole 9 minutes his hands were shaking on the wheel, and his brain was doing the thing brains do, running the worst movie on a loop. And somewhere in the middle of it, he did a thing he had never once done in 2 years of single fatherhood. He called someone, not because he thought it through, because his thumb found the name before his brain caught up, because in a crisis, you reach for the person who feels like home, and that person, it turned out, was no longer his ex-wife and no longer his own stubborn solitude. Ethan. Claire picked up on the first ring. Lily fell, at school. They think her wrist's broken. I'm 9, I'm driving, I'm almost there, I don't... He heard his own voice crack and hated it. I don't know why I'm calling you. Which school? No hesitation. Not 1 second of it. Lincoln. Off Fulton. I'm 4 blocks from there. I'll be there before you. I'll go straight to the nurse. Ethan? She's okay. Wrists heal. Kids break wrists. It's practically a rite of passage. She is going to be completely fine. You just drive safe and get here in one piece because the last thing that kid needs today is 2 family members in the hospital. You hear me? Yeah? Say it back. Drive safe. Good. I'm hanging up. I'm going to her. She hung up. And Ethan Walker drove the last stretch to his daughter's school with his heart pounding out of his chest, and the one thought cutting clean through all the panic was this. She said family. She said the last thing Lily needs is 2 family members in the hospital. She counts. Somewhere in the last 2 weeks, without either of us deciding it, she started counting as family. When he ran into the nurse's office 4 minutes later, breathless, wild-eyed, he stopped dead in the doorway. Because Lily was sitting on the little cot with her wrist wrapped in a temporary splint, tear-streaked but calm, and Claire was sitting right beside her, one arm around the girl, and she was in the middle of telling some story that had Lily almost smiling through the tears. Claire looked up when he came in, and she didn't let go of Lily, and she said in the steadiest voice in the world, "Here's your dad. Told you he'd fly." "Daddy," Lily said, and her face crumpled, and Ethan crossed the room and got down on his knees and pulled his daughter into him, careful of the wrist, and she cried into his shoulder, and over the top of her head, his eyes met Claire's. He didn't have words for what he was feeling. There weren't any. 2 weeks ago, this woman was a stranger. 2 weeks ago, he had a plan to never feel anything again. And now she was sitting in a nurse's office holding his daughter together until he could get there, having dropped whatever she was doing without a half-second's hesitation, and Ethan understood with a clarity that frightened him that he was not in fact going to be able to protect himself from this. It was already too late. It had been too late since the fence. "Thank you," he mouthed over Lily's head. Claire just shook her head like there's nothing to thank, like obviously, and that shake of the head undid him more than any words could have. They took Lily to get the wrist x-rayed. It was a clean break, the good kind of cast, and 6 weeks, and she'd be fine. Claire stayed the whole time. She held the paperwork while Ethan held Lily. She ran out and came back with a milkshake because a broken wrist requires a milkshake. Those are the rules, I don't make them. She let Lily pick the color of the cast. Lily picked orange, like the marigolds. And when the tech asked if Claire was the girl's mother, there was a half-second where the whole room held its breath, and Claire said easy as anything, "I'm a friend of the family." And Lily said at the exact same time, "She's our Claire." And everybody laughed, and the tense little moment dissolved. Our Claire. Ethan filed that away in the same place he kept the note taped inside the cabinet. That night, after Lily was finally asleep, exhausted and proud of her orange cast, Ethan and Claire sat on his porch this time, and neither of them said much for a while. "You dropped everything," Ethan finally said. "In the middle of your day, for a kid who isn't yours." "She's kind of mine now," Claire said. Whether I planned it or not. Same as you. She said it lightly, but she didn't take it back, and Ethan noticed she didn't take it back. You've got a job offer 2 states away, he said. You've got a house you're about to lose. You've got every reason in the world to keep your distance from a man and a kid who are just going to make it harder to leave. He looked at her. And instead you beat me to the hospital. Claire was quiet. Why? Ethan said, turning her own question back on her one more time. And Claire Bennett looked out at the dark street and said the truest thing either of them had said yet. Because I'm scared, Ethan. Same as you. I'm scared that this is real, and I'm scared of how fast it's real, and I'm scared that I'm going to let myself want to stay, and then something's going to take it away, because in my experience, something always takes it away. She turned to look at him. But when that school called you, and you called me, you didn't call your mother or a friend or your ex. You called me. And I was already running out the door before I even knew I'd decided to. And somewhere between my house and that school, it hit me that I've been about to make the smart, safe, sensible decision to leave, and the smart, safe, sensible decision would be the single stupidest thing I've ever done. Her voice dropped. I don't want the fresh start 2 states away, Ethan. I want this. This scary, complicated, mortgage-shaped broken wrist wrecked my whole plan this. And it terrifies me that I want it because now I've got something to lose again. Ethan reached over in the dark and took her hand. It was the first time either of them had touched on purpose. Not a handshake on a flooded floor, not an arm around a crying kid. On purpose. Then don't leave, he said quietly. Give me the rest of my week. I've got more than you think. I've been working on it since the night on the steps. I didn't want to say anything until it was real, but it's getting real. Claire, there's a way through this. I can almost see the whole shape of it. Just don't call that center yet, please. Claire looked down at their hands, then back up at him. Ethan, she said, there's something I have to tell you about the center. Before you spend another day trying to save my house. Something in her voice changed. Something dropped out of the bottom of it. And Ethan felt the night tilt, felt the good moment start to curdle into something else. Because he knew that tone, he'd used that tone. It was the tone of a person about to hand you the piece of information that changes everything. The offer isn't just a job, Claire said. I didn't tell you all of it. I couldn't. Because if I told you all of it, you'd stop trying to keep me here. And 2 weeks ago, I wanted you to stop. And now I don't. And that makes what I'm about to say the hardest thing I've had to say in a long time. She took a breath. The center 2 states away, Claire said. The one that wants to hire me. It's not a new job at a new place. She held his eyes. It's my ex-husband's. He runs it. And the job comes with a very clear, very specific offer to try again. Us. Him and me. Her voice was barely above a whisper now. He's the reason I came back here in the first place, Ethan. I came back to my grandmother's house to get away from him, and now he's found a way to make going back look like the sensible thing, the safe thing, the smart financial decision. She was shaking. And until a garden hose came through my window, I was actually thinking about saying yes. Ethan let go of her hand. He didn't mean it as a rejection. His hand just came loose on its own the way you set something down when your whole body forgets it's holding it. And he saw Claire register the loss of it, saw the flinch cross her face, and he wanted to reach back and take it again and couldn't because his brain was still catching up to the words. Your ex-husband, he said. Yes. The one you moved back here to get away from. Yes. He runs the center, the one offering you the job. He owns it. Started it after the divorce with money. That was half of it should have been mine, honestly. But that's a different fight. I lost a long time ago. Claire wasn't looking at him now. She was looking at her own hands in her lap. His name is Daniel, and about a month before your hose came through my window, he called me. Out of the blue. Said he'd heard the Fulton Center was closing. Said he had an opening. Said it would be good for both of us to have a fresh start, and wouldn't it be something working together again the way we used to before it all went wrong? And you were thinking about it. I was drowning, Ethan. Her voice cracked on his name. You have to understand what it's like. I'd just lost the job I built my whole life around. I was about to lose the only house I've ever loved. And here comes the one person who knows me, who knows the work, who's offering me a paycheck and a place and a way out of the free fall. And yes, God help me. For about 2 weeks, I sat in that house and I told myself that maybe Daniel had changed, that maybe I'd remembered it worse than it was, that maybe going back wasn't giving up, it was just being practical. She finally looked up. That's what fear does. It dresses up the thing you ran from and tells you it's a rescue. Ethan sat very still. 2 years. 2 years he'd spent building a life around the certainty that good things get taken away. And here it was, right on schedule, taking the shape he never would have guessed. Not the bank, not distance, not a better job in a nicer city. An ex-husband. A man with history and money, and a claim that went back years, offering Claire the one thing Ethan couldn't, a whole life already built, waiting familiar. Did you love him? Ethan said. It wasn't the question he meant to ask. It was the question that came out. Once. A long time ago. Claire's jaw tightened. And then I spent the last 2 years of that marriage learning the difference between a man who loves you and a man who needs to be the most important thing in your life. Daniel needed to be the son Ethan. Everything in my life had to orbit him. My work mattered only if it made him look good. My friends were competition. When I started spending too many nights at the center with kids who needed me, he made it a war. Made me choose. Over and over, in 100 small ways, made me choose between the work I was put on this earth to do and keeping the peace with him. She let out a shaking breath. I chose the peace for a long time. And then one day, I chose the kids. And that was the end. I packed a bag and drove 9 hours to my grandmother's house, and I have been trying to rebuild ever since. And now he wants you back. Now he wants me back at the exact moment I'm too broke and too scared to say no easily. She wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand, angry now, angry at herself. That's the part that makes me sick. He didn't call out of love. He called because he heard I was down. Daniel doesn't want me. He wants me needing him. There's a difference, and it took me a marriage to learn it, and I almost forgot it again the second the ground disappeared under my feet. Ethan looked out into the dark street for a long moment. Then why? He said quietly. Were you still thinking about it 3 days ago? If you know all this, if you can say it out loud this clean, why was it still even a question? Claire was quiet. Because knowing a thing and being strong enough to act on it aren't the same, she said. You know that better than most. You know your ex-wife isn't coming back, and you still said it feels like last Tuesday. Knowing didn't fix the wound. And I knew Daniel was poison, and I was still half packing a bag, because a person who's drowning will grab onto the thing that pushed them under if it's the only thing floating by. She turned to face him fully. That's why I have to tell you this before you spend another day of your life trying to save my house. Because you deserve to know that the thing pulling me away isn't just a job. It's history. It's a whole shape my life used to have. And you deserve to decide whether you still want to fight for a woman who was, until 2 weeks ago, seriously considering going back to her ex. Ethan didn't answer right away. And in the silence, Claire's face started to close. He watched it happen. Watched her read his silence as the answer watched 2 years of being made to feel like too much rise up in her and tell her she'd just talked the one good thing out of her own life. She stood up. Okay, she said, brisk brittle. That's okay, that's fair. I shouldn't have. You've got a daughter and a whole life to protect. And I just dumped a 9-hour drive of baggage on your porch. Forget the week. Forget the house. I'll figure it out. I always figure it out. Thank you for the milkshake, and for the fence, and for... Sit down. Claire stopped. Please, Ethan said. Sit down. She sat. Slowly. On the edge of the step, like she might bolt. I wasn't quiet because I was deciding whether you were worth it, Ethan said. I was quiet because I was doing math. He turned to look at her. 2 years ago, my wife left, and I decided the safest thing I could do was never want anything again. And it worked. It really worked, Claire. I built a whole fortress out of not wanting. And then a hose I was holding jumped the fence, and I met a woman who laughs at disasters and now here I am, and the fortress is just gone. Rubble. You knocked it down with a peach pie and a note telling me to stop being nice." He shook his head. "So when you tell me there's an ex-husband in history, and a man who can offer you a whole ready-made life, I can't compete with the math I was doing, wasn't whether you're worth it. It was whether I've got the nerve to want something again knowing it could get taken. That's the only question that was ever on the table, and I got my answer about 10 seconds ago." Claire's breath caught. "What's the answer?" "The answer is, I'm too far in to protect myself anyway," Ethan said. "So I might as well fight." He reached over and took her hand back, the one he'd let go of, and held it like he meant it this time. "You said Daniel wants you needing him, that he called because you were down. Fine. Then here's the difference, and I need you to hear it because I think you've forgotten what it sounds like. I don't want you needing me. I want you when you're strong. I want you when you've got a job and a paid-off house and don't need a single thing from me. The whole point of the week I asked for isn't to make you dependent on me so you'll stay. It's the opposite. I want to help you get back on your own 2 feet so that if you stay, you're staying because you want to, not because you're drowning, not because I'm the thing that floated by." His voice roughened. "You should never have to choose between the work you were put here to do and the person you're with. That's the one thing I can promise you I'll never make you do. Not once. Not ever." Claire made a sound that was half a sob and half a laugh, and she pressed her free hand over her mouth. "You've known me 2 weeks, she whispered. "You keep saying that like it's a defense. It's not. 2 weeks is enough to know a person's shape." He squeezed her hand. "Give me the week. Not to trap you, to free you. And then at the end of it, if you still want to drive 9 hours back to a man who made you choose, I'll help you pack. I mean that. It'll break me, but I'll help you pack because wanting the best for somebody means wanting it even when the best isn't you." He held her eyes. "But I don't think it's him, Claire. I think you already know it's not him. I think you're just scared and broke and out of options, and I'm asking for 1 week to change the options. That's all. 1 week to make sure that whatever you choose, you're choosing it free." For a long moment, Claire didn't move. Then she leaned over in the dark and put her forehead against his shoulder, and she cried. Not the grief crying from the flooded floor, not the alone crying from her own front steps, but a third kind. He hadn't heard from her yet. The kind that comes out when someone finally says the thing you'd stopped believing anyone would ever say to you. 1 week, she said into his shoulder. 1 week, he agreed. The next morning, Ethan Walker went to war. He didn't call it that. He called it looking into some things. But Lily, who noticed everything, watched her father move through the house that Wednesday with a focus she hadn't seen since before her mother left. And at breakfast she said, "Dad, you look like you're going to fix something big." And Ethan said, "I am, Bug. I really am." He'd already been building it in secret since the night on the steps before he even knew about Daniel. Now the deadline had teeth. He had until the end of the month, and it was already the 14th, and somewhere 2 states away, a man named Daniel was waiting for an answer that Ethan was determined to change. He started with the reverse mortgage. He'd learned enough at the assessor's office to know the shape of it, but now he brought in the lawyer who owed him the favor. Renata Sharp as a tack, who'd once had a water main burst in her basement at 11 at night, and Ethan had come out and fixed it and refused to bill her for the after hours. She looked at Claire's paperwork for 20 minutes and then looked up and said, "Okay, first thing. The bank's been telling her she has 6 weeks. That's not quite true. There's a hardship deferral she qualifies for that buys 90 days, and nobody at the bank mentioned it because nobody at the bank makes money by mentioning it. That alone changes everything. 90 days is a completely different fight than 6 weeks. Ethan felt the first door open. Then came the harder part. 90 days bought time, but time wasn't money, and Claire still had no income. So Ethan did the thing he was best at, which was seeing the whole house at once and finding the part everybody else had missed. Claire's grandmother's house had a full second floor that Claire had been living around using 2 rooms and closing off the rest because it hurt to be in the spaces where her grandmother used to be. Ethan walked it and saw something different. He saw an income. A separate entrance goes right here, he told Renata and Claire, standing at the bottom of the back stairs, sketching in the air with his hands. Upstairs has already got its own bathroom. Put a little kitchenette in the corner room, frame a wall here, and you've got a legal one-bedroom rental. I can do the whole build myself, materials only. In this neighborhood near the university, that's real rent every month. Enough to cover the deferred mortgage, and then some. Claire stared at the stairs. I can't afford a renovation, Ethan. That's the whole problem. I have no money. You have a contractor who owes you for a flood, Ethan said. Labor's free. Materials I can get at cost. And he hesitated, then decided the truth was worth the fight. The materials money's already set aside. I'll tell you where it came from, and you're going to be angry. But hear me out first. It's not a gift. It's an investment. You pay me back out of the first year's rent with a fair interest on paper signed. Renata draws it up. This isn't me making you need me. This is a business loan between two adults, and I'm betting on the house because I know houses, and this house is a good bet. He held her eyes. I told you I don't want you needing me. So I'm not giving you money. I'm giving you a mortgage you can actually pay and a business you actually own. There's a difference. You taught me the difference. Claire's eyes filled, and Renata, watching the two of them, said dryly, I'll draw up the loan. Both of you sign it. And Claire, he's right about the deferral and he's right about the rental. This is real. This isn't a fairy tale. This is a legally sound plan. And I'd give the same advice to a paying client. That was the 15th. The plan had bones now. But a plan needs a body, and the body Claire needed most wasn't the house at all. It was the work. Because Ethan had understood something on the flooded floor 2 weeks ago, and it had only gotten clearer since Claire could lose the house and survive it. What was actually killing her was losing the kids. The center closing had taken her purpose, and a woman without her purpose was a woman who'd eventually say yes to Daniel just to have somewhere to pour herself. Save the house and lose the work, and she'd still leave. Ethan knew it in his bones. So on the 16th, he did something completely outside anything he'd ever done. Something that scared him more than the fence, more than the phone call from the school, more than the freefall of wanting Claire in the first place. He asked for help. Ethan Walker, who did everything alone, who fixed the world's houses by himself and raised his daughter by himself, and had gone 2 years without asking a single soul for a single thing. Ethan started knocking on doors. He started with the parents of the kids in Lily's class, because he knew them a little from drop-off. He told them about the counselor next door, who kept files on kids the world forgot. He told them about the center closing over a line in a budget. He told them plainly that a woman who'd spent her life catching kids before they fell through was about to fall through herself. And he asked if anybody knew, anybody had any room, any idea, any way to keep her doing the one thing she was born to do. He was terrible at it at first. He'd stand on porches and stammer and feel like a fool. But he kept going because Lily came with him after school those afternoons. Orange cast and all. And Lily was not terrible at it. Lily would look up at some parent in a doorway and say, Claire helped me when I broke my wrist, and she helps kids who don't have anybody, and now she doesn't have anybody either, and that's not fair. And Ethan watched grown adults come apart on their own porches at the sound of it. He didn't tell Claire he was doing it. That was the one part he kept secret. He told her he was working on the house, which was true, and he let her believe that was all. By the 18th, something was happening that Ethan hadn't planned and couldn't control. It had gotten loose from him. One of the parents he'd talked to ran the after-school program at the community center on Baker Street, and she'd mentioned Claire to the director, and the director had pulled the old records and found that Claire Bennett had a reputation in this town that Claire herself had apparently forgotten she had. Kids she'd counseled years ago. Families she'd held together. A whole quiet legacy of a woman who showed up that she'd been too deep in her own drowning to remember existed, and people started calling Ethan. That was the part that undid him. His phone started ringing with people he'd never met saying, I heard you're trying to help Claire Bennett. My daughter wouldn't have graduated without that woman. What can I do? He was standing in Claire's future rental unit on the evening of the 18th, drywall dust on his hands, when his phone rang with a number he didn't know, and he almost didn't answer. And he was glad for the rest of his life that he did. "Is this Ethan Walker?" A woman's voice, official, careful. "Speaking." "My name is Patricia Vance. I'm on the board of the Baker Street Community Center. I understand you've been making some inquiries about Claire Bennett." A pause. "I want to have a conversation with you, but before I do, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me because it matters. What is she to you? Are you a colleague, family? What's your stake in this?" Ethan stood in the half-built room, drywall dust on his hands, and told the truth. "2 weeks ago, I flooded her living room with a garden hose," he said, "by accident. And she laughed instead of yelling. And it turned out she'd been drowning for a year and nobody had noticed. And I've got an 8-year-old who thinks the sun rises and sets on her, and I've spent 2 years too scared to want anything, and she's the first thing I've wanted in all that time." He swallowed. "So my stake is, I'm in love with her, Ms. Vance, and she doesn't fully know it yet, and there's a man 2 states away trying to pull her back into a bad marriage because she's broke and scared and out of options. And I'm trying to change the options. That's my stake. That's all of it." The line was quiet for a moment. "Well," Patricia Vance said, "that's the most honest answer I've gotten from a man in about 10 years. Mr. Walker, I think you should come to our board meeting on Thursday, and I think you should bring Claire. But don't tell her why." Ethan's heart started pounding. "What's on Thursday?" "On Thursday," Patricia said, "we're voting on whether to fund a new youth counseling position. We've had the money for a while, a bequest actually from a woman who used to volunteer here. We just never had the right person to build it around. Half the board wasn't even sure it was worth doing." A dry warmth came into her voice. "And then, in the last 4 days, my phone has not stopped ringing about a counselor named Claire Bennett. From parents, from teachers, from 2 former mayors, if you can believe it. I've been on this board 11 years, Mr. Walker, and I have never seen a town rise up for one person the way this town has risen up for her in a week." A pause. "You did that. You, and from what I hear, a little girl in an orange cast." Ethan had to sit down on an overturned bucket. "Thursday," he managed. 7 o'clock. Bring her, and Mr. Walker." Patricia's voice softened. "For what it's worth. A man who'd knock on 30 doors for a woman who doesn't even know he's doing it. That's the kind of thing she should get to see. Whatever happens with the vote, she should get to see that somebody did that for her." Click. Ethan sat on the bucket in the half-built room for a long time. He'd asked for 1 week. It was the 18th. Thursday was the 20th. He had 2 days. 2 days and a hardship deferral and a rental unit half-built and a lawyer drawing up a fair loan, and now, impossibly terrifyingly, a whole town that had woken up and remembered a woman it had forgotten, and a board meeting where they might just hand her back the one thing she'd lost that couldn't be rebuilt with drywall and a garden hose. But there was a problem, and Ethan felt it settle in his stomach as he sat there. Because he'd been so busy fighting for Claire's future that he'd forgotten to check whether Claire was still fighting for it too. 2 days was a long time when a person was scared, and there was a man named Daniel out there who was also presumably making his own case. And Claire hadn't said yes to Ethan. She'd only said yes to the week. He drove home that night full of hope and dread in equal measure. And when he pulled into his driveway, the hope curdled because there was a car parked in front of Claire's house that he didn't recognize. Out-of-state plates. A nice car. The kind of car a man buys when he needs everyone to know he's done well for himself. Ethan sat in his truck and looked at that car for a long moment. Then he saw the front door of Claire's house open and a man step out onto the porch. Tall. Well-dressed. Standing on Claire's porch like he had every right to be there. And Claire stepping out behind him, arms crossed tight over her chest, her whole body language, wrong, closed, defensive, the exact opposite of the open, laughing woman Ethan had come to know. Daniel had come 9 hours early. He hadn't waited for the phone call. He'd driven the whole 9 hours and shown up on her doorstep because a man like that doesn't wait for an answer he thinks he's owed. He comes to collect it in person where it's harder to say no. Ethan's hands tightened on the wheel, Every instinct he had said get out of the truck, go over there, stand between them. But he made himself stop because he'd promised her something on those steps, and he understood now that this was the exact moment the promise meant something. He'd told her he wanted her strong. He'd told her he didn't want to be the thing she grabbed onto while drowning. If he charged over there and fought Daniel on that porch, he'd be making himself the son, just a different son than Daniel and Claire would be, right back in the middle of two men fighting over her like she was a thing to be won. That wasn't the promise. The promise was to free her, and you don't free someone by winning them. So Ethan Walker did the hardest thing he'd done in 2 years. He sat in his truck, and he watched, and he let Claire fight her own fight. He couldn't hear the words, but he could read the shapes. Daniel gesturing smooth, persuasive, the practiced ease of a man who'd talked her into things 1,000 times before. Claire, arms crossed, shaking her head. Daniel stepping closer, Claire stepping back. And then Daniel's hand coming up to her arm, not rough, but proprietary. The touch of a man who thought her body was still his to reach for. And Ethan was out of the truck before he knew it, because there were promises, and there were lines, and a man putting his hands on a woman who'd stepped away from him was a line. But he didn't have to cross the yard, because Claire pulled her arm back hard, and her voice rose enough that it carried across the dark, and Ethan stopped at the edge of his own driveway and heard her say, clear as anything, "Don't touch me, Daniel. You don't get to touch me. You lost that a long time ago." Daniel said something Ethan couldn't hear, and Claire said louder, stronger than Ethan had ever heard her, "No, you listen to me for once in your life. You didn't drive 9 hours because you love me. You drove 9 hours because you heard I was down, and you have never in your life been able to stand the idea of me being okay without you. That's not love, Daniel. That's ownership. And I spent 2 years learning the difference, and I am not unlearning it in one night on my own front porch." Ethan stood frozen at the edge of his driveway. "I have a plan," Claire was saying, and her voice was shaking, but it wasn't breaking. It was the shake of someone standing their ground while terrified, which is the bravest kind of shaking there is. "I have a house I'm going to keep. I have a lawyer. I have a business I'm building. And I have—" She stopped, and Ethan's heart stopped with her. "I have people here who showed up for me. Do you understand that? While you were 9 hours away deciding when to come collect me, there were people here who showed up, who fixed my house and who fixed my house and asked for nothing. So no. The answer is no. It was always going to be no. I just needed to stop being scared long enough to say it." There was a long silence on the porch. Then Daniel said something low and cold, the smoothness gone out of it, and whatever it was, made Claire go still. And Ethan couldn't hear it, but he saw its effect. Saw Claire's arms tighten and her chin drop, saw the old fear come back into her body like a tide coming in. And he understood that Daniel had reached past all her defenses and found the one soft place he still knew how to press. Men like that always knew where it was. They spent the whole marriage mapping it, and Ethan, watching from the dark, realized that Claire had won the argument, but Daniel had just changed the game. Because a man who can't win with love will always reach for the thing that hurts. And whatever Daniel had just said, it had landed somewhere deep, and Claire's strength was draining out of her right there on the porch, and Ethan didn't know the words, but he knew the shape of what was happening. Daniel wasn't leaving. He was just getting started. What Daniel had said Ethan learned later was 7 words. Just 7. And they were the cruelest 7 words a man could have chosen because they were aimed at the exact wound Claire had spent 2 years trying to close. "Those kids were never really yours, Claire." That was it. That was the thing that drained the strength out of her body on the porch. Because Daniel knew, of course he knew he'd been married to her, he'd mapped every soft place that the deepest fear Claire Bennett carried was that her whole life's work was a kind of borrowing. That she poured herself into other people's children because she didn't have her own, because the marriage that was supposed to give her a family had given her nothing but a man who needed to be the center of everything. Daniel knew that every kid Claire had ever counseled eventually aged out, moved on, forgot her. And he knew that if he named it, those kids were never really yours. He could make her feel in one sentence, like the last 2 years had been a woman screaming into an empty room. And it worked. For about 90 seconds, it worked. Ethan watched from the dark as Claire's shoulders came down, and her chin dropped, and the fight went out of her. And Daniel pressed his advantage the way men like that always do. The second they smell weakness, stepping closer. His voice going soft and reasonable again, now that he'd found the knife. But Ethan couldn't hear the words. And so Ethan almost missed the moment everything turned, because a small figure came out onto Ethan's own porch, behind him in pajamas, one arm in an orange cast, having heard the raised voices through her bedroom window. "Dad," Lily said. "Why is a stranger yelling at Claire?" And that small, sleepy, frightened voice from his own porch is what broke Ethan's paralysis. Not Daniel's cruelty, his daughter's fear. He turned and crossed to Lily and crouched down and said, "It's okay, Bug. That's someone Claire used to know. Grown-up stuff. I need you to go back inside and I'll be right." "Is he going to make her leave?" Ethan stopped. "Claire," Lily said, and her lower lip was going the way it did right before the tears. "Is he here to make Claire leave? Because I heard you on the phone with the lawyer lady, and you said Claire might have to leave and I don't. Dad, I don't want her to leave. She's the only one who lets me talk about Mom." And there it was. Out of the mouth of an 8-year-old, the whole thing, the naked whole thing, the truth. Ethan had been dancing around for 2 weeks. He knelt on his porch and looked at his daughter's face and understood that this wasn't just his fight anymore. And it had never been just his. Lily had lost one woman she loved already. She was standing here in an orange cast begging her father not to let it happen twice. "No," Ethan said. "No, Bug. She's not leaving. Not if I have anything to say about it." "Then say something," Lily said. The exact words, though, she couldn't have known it, that Claire had said to him on the flooded floor 2 weeks ago. "Then say something." Ethan stood up. He'd promised himself he'd let Claire fight her own fight. He'd believed sitting in that truck that charging over there would make him just another man trying to be her son. And maybe that was true. But there's a difference, he understood now, between fighting a woman's battle for her and standing next to her while she fights it. Between rescuing someone and refusing to let them stand alone. Daniel had gotten past her defenses by making her feel like nobody had ever really been hers. The answer to that wasn't to fight Daniel. The answer was to prove him wrong. "Come on," Ethan said, and he took his daughter's good hand. And Ethan Walker walked across the dark yard toward Claire's porch. Not fast, not angry, his 8-year-old daughter in her pajamas and orange cast walking beside him. And Daniel turned at the sound of them coming, and Ethan watched the man's face do a quick, ugly recalculation. "Can I help you?" Daniel said. Smooth. Territorial. "No," Ethan said. "I'm not here for you." He looked past Daniel to Claire, whose eyes had come up and locked onto his and onto Lily's, and whose face was doing something complicated and desperate. "Claire, my daughter couldn't sleep. She heard the voices. She's got something she wants to say to you, and I told her she could say it. That's all. That's the only reason I'm over here." Claire's mouth opened. Ethan crouched down beside Lily. "Go ahead, Bug. Tell her what you told me." And Lily, 8 years old, terrified, one arm in a cast, looked up at the woman she'd decided weeks ago was hers and said, "I don't want you to leave. You're the only grown-up who lets me talk about my mom. Everybody else gets sad and changes the subject, but you just listen. And I already lost one person, and I don't want to lose you too." Her voice wobbled. "And I know I'm just a kid and this is grown-up stuff. But you told me the day the water came in that I didn't break your house. I introduced you to your neighbors. So I'm introducing you again. This is my dad. And we love you. And you don't have to go anywhere if you don't want to." Nobody said anything. Daniel looked for the first time genuinely thrown because whatever move he'd been prepared to counter, it wasn't this. You can't argue with an 8-year-old in an orange cast. There's no play for it. A man who wins by finding the knife has no answer at all for a child saying "we love you" on a dark porch. And Claire. Claire came apart. But it was a different coming apart than any Ethan had seen from her. Not the grief on the floor, not the loneliness on the steps, not the old fear Daniel had dragged up out of her 90 seconds ago. This was the coming apart of a woman being handed out loud, in words the exact thing a man had just told her she'd never really had. Those kids were never really yours. And here was a kid saying, "You're mine," saying, "We love you," saying you don't have to go. Claire dropped to her knees on her own porch and pulled Lily into her cast and all, and held on. "You didn't lose me," Claire said into the little girl's hair fierce wet. "You hear me? You did not lose me. I'm not going anywhere. I promise you. I promise." And over Lily's head kneeling on the porch, Claire looked up at Ethan and then she looked at Daniel. And Ethan watched the last of the old fear burn out of her eyes, and something else take its place. Something settled. Something decided. She stood up, keeping Lily against her side, one hand on the girl's shoulder, and she faced Daniel with a steadiness Ethan had never seen in her. "You said those kids were never really mine," Claire said. Her voice didn't shake now. "And for about a minute out here you almost had me. Because that's the fear, right? That's the one you always knew how to press. That everything I love is borrowed, and everyone I help eventually leaves, and at the end of it, I'll be standing in an empty room, having given my whole life to people who forgot me." She pulled Lily a little closer. "But you drove 9 hours to tell me that. And in the 2 weeks it took you to decide when to come collect me, this child right here decided I was hers, without anybody asking her to. So you're wrong, Daniel. You've been wrong about me for years, and you just proved it standing on my porch. The kids were always real. The love was always real. The only thing that was never real was you and me." Daniel's jaw worked. The smoothness was entirely gone now. "You're going to lose this house," he said. And the cruelty was bare and open. Now no charm left over it. "You know that. You've got no job, no income, and a mortgage you can't touch. You can play house with the handyman and his kid all you want, but in 6 weeks, the bank takes it, and then what? You'll be exactly where you were when I called. Except you'll have wasted your last chance." 90 days, Ethan said. Daniel turned. "Hardship deferral," Ethan said evenly. "She qualifies. The bank didn't mention it because the bank doesn't make money mentioning it, but it's real, and it's filed as of this morning. So it's not 6 weeks. It's 90 days. And in 90 days, she'll have a rental unit generating income. Upstairs permits are in. I'm building it myself. It's half-framed already. And a signed notarized business loan that covers materials that she pays back out of rent at interest like an adult because she doesn't need to be rescued. She needs a fair shot, and now she's got one." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You came here thinking she had 2 doors, Daniel. Sell the house or lose it. Go back to you or go broke. And you were counting on her being too scared and too tired to look for a 3rd door. But I fix houses for a living, and there's always a 3rd door. Always. You just have to know how to look for it." The porch was silent, and then because the universe has a sense of timing, headlights swung into the street. And another car. And another. Ethan hadn't planned it. He swore later that he hadn't planned it, that it was pure coincidence that Patricia Vance had simply told 2 board members, and they'd told others, and word had gotten around that Claire Bennett's ex-husband had rolled into town, and this town that had woken up in the space of a week, and remembered a woman it had forgotten, was not about to let her face him alone. It was Patricia Vance's car in front. She got out, 60-some years old, no nonsense. And behind her a young man in his 20s who Ethan didn't recognize, but who Claire clearly did because Claire made a sound when she saw him. And behind that, 2 more cars' parents from Lincoln Elementary, and behind that, a woman with a teenage daughter, and the daughter was looking at Claire the way you look at someone who once saved your life. "Claire Bennett," Patricia Vance said, walking up the path like she owned it. "I hope we're not interrupting." Claire couldn't speak. The young man in his 20s stepped forward. "You probably don't recognize me," he said to Claire. "I was 14. Foster placement fell through. I was about to age into the system with nothing, and you sat with me for a year and told me I wasn't a lost cause, even when everybody else had a file that said I was." He glanced at Daniel, then back to Claire. I'm in my second year of nursing school now. I heard you were in trouble. I drove 3 hours to stand on your porch tonight because you spent a year making sure I didn't fall through. So, he shrugged and his voice cracked. Here I am, not falling through, because of you. Claire put her hand over her mouth. Those kids were never really yours. Ethan heard the words in his memory and watched them die one by one on that porch, as the proof of how wrong they were kept climbing out of cars and walking up the path. A woman whose daughter graduated. A father whose son got clean. A former mayor who really did show up, an old man in a windbreaker, who shook Claire's hand and said, "My granddaughter, 8 years ago, you know the one." And Claire, who had spent a year convinced she'd been screaming into an empty room, stood on her grandmother's porch and watched the room fill up with everyone who'd heard her. Daniel stood in the middle of it, and Ethan almost felt something like pity, watching a man realize he'd driven 9 hours to a battle that was already lost before he arrived. He'd come to collect a woman he thought was alone. And she wasn't alone. She'd never been alone. She'd just forgotten. "I think," Patricia Vance said, turning to Daniel with the polite lethality of a woman who'd chaired 1,000 contentious meetings, "that you have a long drive ahead of you, and I think Ms. Bennett has a board meeting to attend on Thursday, where, and I probably shouldn't say this in front of her, but the cat seems to be leaving the bag on its own tonight, where I have every confidence she's going to be offered a position building a youth counseling program from the ground up, fully funded, permanent, hers." She smiled without warmth at Daniel. "So, I don't believe she'll be needing whatever it is you drove all this way to offer. But it was good of you to come. Long trip. Do drive safe." It was masterful. Ethan wanted to applaud. Daniel looked around the porch, the yard, the faces, and Ethan watched a man do the math and come up empty. There was nothing left to press. No knife left to find. Every soft place he'd mapped over years of marriage had just been filled in the space of 10 minutes, by a town and a child and a plan he hadn't seen coming. He straightened his jacket. He tried one last time to find the smoothness, and it came out hollow. "You'll regret this," he said to Claire. "No," Claire said. "I regretted the other thing, for 2 years. This..." She looked around at the porch full of people, at Ethan, at Lily against her side. "This I'm going to be grateful for every day of my life. Goodbye, Daniel. Drive safe. Patricia's right about that part at least." And Daniel left. He walked to his nice car with the out-of-state plates, and he drove away into the dark. 9 hours the way he'd come, and the whole porch watched him go, and nobody said anything until his taillights turned the corner and were gone. And then the porch full of people let out a breath altogether, and somebody laughed and somebody else started crying. And the young man from nursing school hugged Claire, and the former mayor clapped Ethan on the shoulder and said, "Good man." And for a few minutes, Claire's grandmother's porch was the fullest, warmest, most alive it had been since the old woman died, and Ethan stood at the edge of it and watched Claire in the middle of all those people who'd come for her, and he thought his chest might actually crack open. It took a while for everyone to leave. Patricia was the last, and before she went, she took Claire's hands and said quietly, "Thursday, 7 o'clock. But between us, dear, it's a formality. The vote's already there. I just wanted you to have it in a room in front of witnesses, so you could never talk yourself out of believing it." She glanced at Ethan. "That man over there knocked on half the doors in this town for you and never told you he was doing it. Made his little girl the closer from what I hear, though I suspect she volunteered." A dry smile. "Whatever's happening between you two, Claire, don't be scared of it. I've been on this earth 68 years, and I can count on one hand the number of men who do what he did and ask for nothing. Don't waste it being afraid." Then she was gone too, and it was just the three of them on the porch. Ethan and Claire and Lily, who was fading fast now, the adrenaline wearing off, leaning heavy against Claire's side. "I should get her to bed," Ethan said. "I know." Neither of them moved. "You knocked on half the doors in this town?" Claire said. "Patricia talks too much." "You did that, for me, and you didn't tell me." "I didn't want to give you a hope," Ethan said. "I wanted to give you a thing. There's a difference. You get a person's hopes up, and it doesn't pan out. You've just made everything worse. I didn't want to hand you a maybe. I wanted to hand you a room full of people who love you and a job and a house you get to keep. So I waited until it was real." He shrugged, uncomfortable under her eyes. "It got real faster than I thought." Daniel showing up moved everybody's timeline. Claire was quiet for a moment. Lily was nearly asleep against her. "When you told Patricia Vance what your stake was," Claire said slowly, "on the phone, whatever you said to her, she looked at you tonight like she already knew the whole thing. What did you tell her, Ethan?" Ethan's throat went dry, because here it was. The thing he hadn't said out loud to Claire yet. He'd said it to a stranger on the phone in a half-built room, easy as anything. I'm in love with her, and she doesn't fully know it yet, but he hadn't said it to Claire. He'd shown it. He'd shown it in fences and freeze-dried documents and hardship deferrals and 30 knocked doors. But he hadn't said it. 2 years of a locked room, and even now, with the fortress rubble, with a town on his side, with the woman standing right in front of him, holding his sleeping daughter. The words caught behind his teeth like they always had. "Ethan," Claire said softly, "what did you tell her?" And Ethan Walker, 38 years old, who said what he'd do and did what he said, who'd spent 2 years too scared to want a single thing, looked at Claire Bennett over the head of his sleeping daughter, and finally said the thing out loud. "I told her I'm in love with you," he said. "That's my stake. That's what I told her. I've been in love with you since about the second week since the pie and the note telling me to stop being nice, and I've shown it every way I know how, because saying it terrified me because the last time I loved someone she left, and it took me 2 years to stand back up, and I promised myself I'd never do it again. And then a hose jumped a fence." His voice was rough, barely holding. "I know it's fast. I know it's 2 weeks or 3 now, I've lost count. And I'm not asking you for anything. You just got your whole life back tonight, and the last thing you need is a man asking you to promise him something. But you asked what I told her, and I'm done keeping true things in my pocket around you. So there it is. I love you, Claire. I have for a while." Claire didn't say anything for a moment, and Ethan in the silence felt every old fear crawl back up his spine, felt 2 years of certainty that good things get taken away, rise up and whisper. "See, this is where she says it's too fast. This is where the good thing ends." Claire shifted Lily's weight gently, freeing one arm, and reached out and put her hand against the side of Ethan's face. "You want to know the truth?" she said. "The whole embarrassing truth." Her eyes were wet, but she was smiling that smile, the one from the flooded floor. "I fell first. I fell the day you got down on your knees in the flood and started saving my papers before you even knew my name. I've just been better at hiding it than you, because I've had more practice hiding things." Her thumb moved against his cheek. "I was so scared, Ethan. I was so scared this was another thing that would get taken away. And then tonight, I watched an 8-year-old tell a grown man to leave because she wasn't losing me too. And I watched you fill my porch with a whole town. And I realized I've been living exactly the way you have braced for the loss, protecting myself from the good thing by refusing to fully have it." She laughed wet. "We're the same broken person, you and me, braced for the same loss. And I'm so tired of being braced, Ethan. I don't want to spend another day of my life braced against something good." "Then don't," Ethan said. "I love you too," Claire said. "For the record, since the flood, I love you too." And Ethan Walker kissed her on her grandmother's porch, careful of the sleeping 8-year-old between them. And it was not a surprise, and it was not something taken away. And for the first time in 2 years, he understood that not every good thing is a thing you're about to lose. Some good things you get to keep. Lily stirred against them both. Half woke, registered in her sleepy way that the 2 adults she loved most in the world were exactly where she wanted them, and murmured, "Finally," and went back to sleep. And Claire laughed into Ethan's shoulder, and Ethan laughed too, that rusty, unpracticed laugh that was getting less rusty every day. And the 3 of them stood on the porch in the dark, and the street was quiet, and every car full of people who loved her had gone home. And the house Claire was going to keep, stood solid and warm behind them. There were still 2 days until Thursday. There was still a board meeting and a vote and a rental unit to finish, and a hardship deferral working its way through a bank, and a whole life to build out of the rubble of 2 people's fortresses. It wasn't finished. Ethan knew better than anyone that a house is 100 small failures held together by somebody who cares enough to catch them. There'd be more failures. There always were. But standing on that porch with the woman he loved in his arms and his daughter asleep between them and a town behind them that had remembered how to show up. Ethan Walker understood that he finally had the one thing his careful, predictable, locked-down life had been missing. He had someone to catch them with. Thursday came faster than either of them was ready for. Ethan spent the 2 days between finishing the rental unit and pretending he wasn't nervous, which fooled no one, least of all Lily, who kept catching him staring at nothing with a paintbrush going dry in his hand. "You're doing the fixing something big face again," she told him Wednesday night, and he said, "It's a fixing something big kind of weak bug." And she nodded like that was the most reasonable thing in the world and went back to decorating her orange cast with marker flowers. Claire spent the 2 days terrified in a different direction. Ethan found her Wednesday afternoon standing in the middle of the half-finished rental unit, and she wasn't looking at the drywall or the new kitchenette. She was just standing there. "You okay?" he asked. "What if I get in that room tomorrow?" Claire said, "and I can't do it? What if I stand up in front of that board and Daniel's voice is still in my head, telling me the kids were never really mine, and I freeze and I talk myself out of it? I've done it before, Ethan. I've talked myself out of good things my whole life. It's the thing I'm best at." Ethan set down his tools. "You won't. You don't know that." "I do, actually." He crossed the room to her. "Because you're not walking into that room alone. You've got a whole town coming. And you've got a lawyer who thinks you're a sound investment. And you've got a kid who told a grown man to leave her porch. And you've got me." He took her hands. "The only reason a person talks themselves out of a good thing is that there's nobody in the room reminding them they deserve it. Tomorrow that room is going to be full of people reminding you. You couldn't talk yourself out of it if you tried." Claire looked at him for a long moment. "When did you get good at this?" "At what, Weed? Words. You were terrible at words when I met you. You said everything in fences and freeze-dried paper. Now you're standing in a half-built room saying the exact right thing." Ethan almost smiled. "I had a good teacher. She left notes under my door telling me true things until I learned how to say them out loud." The board meeting was at 7, and by 6:45 the room at the Baker Street Community Center was full. Not board meeting full. People standing along the back wall. The young man from nursing school. The former mayor in his windbreaker. Parents from Lincoln Elementary. The teenage girl and her mother. Word had traveled the same way it had traveled the week before, town to town, door to door. And half of them weren't even on the agenda, they'd just come to be in the room. Patricia Vance took one look at the crowd and leaned over to Claire and murmured, "In 11 years I have never had to turn people away from a vote on a budget line. You've got a gift, dear. People remember you." Claire's hands were shaking. Ethan sat beside her in the second row with Lily on his other side, and he reached over and took Claire's hand under the table and held it. And when the board called the item, the funding of a new permanent youth counseling position, and asked if the candidate wished to say a few words, Claire stood up, and for one terrible second, Ethan watched Daniel's ghost cross her face. Then she looked out at the room. At all of them. And Claire Bennett found her voice. She didn't have notes. She just talked. She talked about the kids who fall through the ones nobody's job to remember the ones who bounce between systems until they age out with nothing. She talked about what it means to be the one person who keeps the file, who remembers, who tells a 14-year-old he isn't a lost cause, even when the paperwork says he is. She looked right at the young man from nursing school when she said it, and he nodded, and half the room was already crying. And then she said something Ethan hadn't heard her say before, something that made him grip Lily's hand a little tighter. 2 weeks ago, Claire said, somebody told me those kids were never really mine, and for about a minute I believed him. Because that's the fear every person in this work carries, that we're pouring ourselves into children who'll grow up and forget us, that at the end of it, we'll be standing in an empty room. She steadied. And then, a room, exactly like this one, filled up with people I thought had forgotten me. And I understood that I'd had it backwards my whole life. You don't do this work to be remembered. You do it so that a kid 20 years from now, standing at the worst moment of their own life, hears a voice that says, "You are not a lost cause," and it's your voice coming out of their mouth, keeping some other kid from falling through. That's not borrowing. That's the opposite of borrowing. That's the only thing any of us really gets to keep. She looked at the board. I would be honored to build this program. I know exactly how to do it. I've been doing it my whole life. I just needed a room to remind me I was allowed to. The vote was unanimous. It wasn't close. Patricia hadn't been exaggerating. It was a formality. But Ethan watched Claire's face when the last hand went up, and he understood that Patricia had been right about the other thing too. Claire needed to hear it in a room out loud, in front of witnesses, so she could never talk herself out of believing it. She sat down after the vote and put her face in her hands, and Ethan pulled her into his side, and Lily patted her arm with the orange cast and said, "See? I told you. You're ours." And Claire laughed through the tears, and the whole room applauded, and it was done. She had a job. A permanent funded real job building the exact thing she was born to build in the town she'd come home to, 10 feet from the man she loved. The 90-day deferral gave them room to breathe, and the rental unit came together fast after that. Ethan finished the framing the following week, and a graduate student from the university took the upstairs by the end of the month, quiet, tidy, paid on time, and the rent covered the deferred mortgage with margin to spare. Claire paid Ethan back the materials loan out of the first 4 months of rent on paper at the fair interest Renata had written into the contract, and she made him sign the receipt each time. And every time she did it, she'd say, "Because I'm not a woman who needs rescuing, Ethan Walker." And every time he'd say, "No, ma'am, you never were." And every time it was a little more of a joke and a little less of a wound. The house was safe. Claire got to keep it. Her grandmother's house with all its memories, the ones that had hurt too much to sit in. And here was the strange thing Ethan noticed as the weeks turned into months. The rooms that had hurt Claire the most started to hurt less because they started to fill up with new things. The room where her grandmother used to sit became the room where Lily did homework. The kitchen where Claire had once eaten dinner alone became the kitchen where 3 people ate dinner most nights, because somewhere in there it had stopped being a question of whose house, and the 2 houses 10 feet apart had quietly become one home with a fence in the middle that nobody bothered to fix. The freeze-dried case files came back at 70%, and Claire built the new program's first records around what survived. And she told Ethan one night that half the kids in those files were the first kids she reached out to when the Baker Street program opened its doors. The ones who'd fallen through once. She found them again. Ethan flooded those files by accident with a garden hose, and in trying to save them, he'd ended up saving her, and in saving her, she'd ended up saving them a second time. And Ethan thought sometimes about the order of it, about how you can't ever really see the order while you're in it. There's an order to everything he'd told Lily the morning it all started. You do it out of order, you make a mess. He'd been so sure of that. And it turned out the biggest good thing of his whole life had come out of the biggest mess in exactly the wrong order from a mistake he'd have given anything to take back in the moment it happened. He thought about Daniel sometimes too, not with anger anymore. Daniel had driven 9 hours to collect a woman he thought was alone and drowning, and he'd driven 9 hours home, having watched a whole town prove him wrong. And wherever he was now, Ethan hoped he'd learned the thing Claire had learned, and he never had that. You can't own a person, and the ones who try end up with nothing, and the ones who show up and ask for nothing end up with everything. Daniel had needed to be the son, and Ethan had watched Claire choose freely. A life where nobody was the son, where 2 people just stood next to each other in the same light. That was the whole difference. That had always been the whole difference. They didn't rush the rest of it. That was the one thing they both agreed on without ever really discussing it. They'd both been broken by things that moved too fast in the wrong direction, and they were in no hurry to move fast in the right one. Ethan didn't propose that first year. He wanted Claire to have a full year of standing on her own 2 feet first, her own job, her own house, her own paid-back loan, because he'd promised her on a dark porch that he'd never be the thing she grabbed onto while drowning, that he wanted her strong, and he meant to keep every word of it. So they took their time. Dinners. Notes still sometimes slid under doors, even though the doors were 10 feet apart, and they saw each other every day because the notes had become theirs, a private language, a thing that was just for them. And Lily bloomed. That was the part Ethan watched most closely. The part that would have stopped him cold if it had gone wrong, and it didn't go wrong. Lily got to talk about her mother out loud finally, because Claire had shown her it was allowed, and slowly the grief that his daughter had been carrying quietly to protect him came out into the open where it could be smaller. Ethan learned to sit in it with her. He learned that letting his daughter see him miss things, hurt over things, didn't break him and didn't break her. It did the opposite. The exact thing Claire had promised on the porch months before. Lily learned that the people who love you are allowed to hurt, and that they'll stay anyway, and that's a lesson worth more than almost any other a kid can get. The cast came off Lily's wrist in 6 weeks, orange marker flowers and all, and she asked to keep it, and Ethan let her, and it sat on her shelf next to a dried marigold from the very first flower bed, the one that had started all of it. It was almost exactly a year later that Ethan finally did it. He didn't make it a big production. That wasn't either of them. He waited until a Saturday morning, the same kind of Saturday it had all begun on, and he asked Claire to come out to the backyard that didn't look sad anymore, that was covered in flowers, now marigolds and impatiens, and a dozen other things Lily had picked over the year. And he'd set the garden hose out on the grass, the same old hose, the one Claire had once packed in a box, because she said it was the only thing in her house that had ever brought her happiness. "What's this?" Claire said, looking at the hose. "Full circle," Ethan said. His hands were shaking, and he didn't try to hide it because he'd learned a year ago to stop keeping true things in his pocket. "A year ago I stepped on this thing and flooded your living room and ruined 2 years of your work and met the best thing that ever happened to me all in about 30 seconds. And I've been trying to figure out the right way to say something ever since, and there isn't one. There's no way to make this make sense, so I'm just going to say it the way you taught me. Plain. Out loud. True." He got down on one knee in the flowers, and Lily came around the corner of the house right on cue. She was in on it. She'd been in on it for weeks. She'd helped him pick the ring, and Claire's hand went to her mouth. "I spent 2 years," Ethan said, certain that every good thing was a thing I was about to lose. "And then you flooded into my life by accident, and you taught me the one thing I never believed. That some good things you get to keep. I want to keep this one, Claire. You and Lily, and this house, and the fence, nobody fixes, and the notes under the door and all of it. Every day, for the rest of my life." His voice broke and he let it. "Marry me. Not because either of us needs rescuing. We proved we don't. Marry me because we're strong, and we chose each other free, and I want to stand next to you in the same light until they put me in the ground. Marry me, Claire." Claire was crying and laughing at the same time, the way she had on the flooded floor a year before, and she said, "You know what the worst part is?" "What?" "I fell first. I fell a year ago on my own living room floor, and I've been waiting for you to catch up this whole time." She pulled him to his feet. "Yes, yes, of course it's yes. It was always going to be yes. I just needed a room to remind you you were allowed to," Ethan said. "I was going to say I needed you to ask," Claire said, laughing, "but yours is better." And then, because the universe has a sense of humor about men who plan things, Lily, who had been standing off to the side vibrating with the effort of keeping a secret for 3 weeks, picked up the garden hose. "Lily," Ethan said. "Bug, no." "Now we're really even," Lily announced and turned the spigot, and the water came on, and Lily sprayed both of them. Her father and her Claire standing in the flowers in the backyard, that used to be the saddest one on the street, and Claire shrieked and Ethan laughed, and grabbed for the hose and missed, and the 3 of them ended up soaked to the skin in the sunshine exactly the way it had all started, except this time, nobody was a stranger, and nobody was drowning, and nobody was about to be taken away. Claire wiped the water off her face, still laughing, and looked at the little girl holding the hose, and said the same words she'd said a year before on that first flooded afternoon, The words that had cracked Ethan Walker's fortress open before either of them knew what was happening. "Well," Claire said, "I guess this is one way to say yes." They got married the next spring in the backyard, under the flowers, and the whole town came, the ones who'd filled the porch, the ones who'd filled the boardroom, the young man from nursing school, who was a nurse, now the teenage girl who was in college, dozens of kids and grown-up kids whose files Claire had kept, whose lives she'd caught before they fell through. Patricia Vance cried. The former mayor wore the same windbreaker. Lily was the flower girl, and threw marigold petals with the enthusiasm of a kid who had personally lobbied for the whole event. And when the officiant asked if anyone knew any reason these two should not be joined, somebody in the back called out, "Only that it took him a whole year to ask." And the entire backyard laughed, and Ethan laughed too, that laugh that wasn't rusty anymore at all. Ethan Walker had built his whole life once around never being surprised again. Around the certainty that good things get taken away, that the safe move is to want nothing, that a man survives by pulling the blinds down and keeping the world at fence length. He'd believed it completely. He'd have gone to his grave believing it. And then a hose jumped a fence. He stood at the front of his own backyard, the sad backyard that wasn't sad anymore, and watched Claire come toward him through a crowd of every person she'd ever saved, and every person who'd saved her back. And he understood finally, and all the way down, the thing it had taken him 40 years and one accident to learn. The people who enter our lives by accident are sometimes the ones who show us the way home, not the plan, not the safe move, not the careful, predictable, locked-down life. The accident, the mistake. The 30 seconds of water through an open window that you'd give anything to take back and would never, ever trade. Claire reached him and took his hands, and they were both a little wet-eyed, and Lily stood between them, because that was the only place she'd ever agreed to stand. And Ethan Walker looked at the family that a garden hose had built, and knew one thing for certain, the way he knew the way a house holds itself up. Some good things you get to keep, and this one he was keeping for the rest of his life.